CQ POTA, CQ Parks on the air. Whiskey 1 Delta, Echo Delta.
Kilo Delta 4, Whiskey India.
Kilo Delta 4, Whiskey India, 5x9 at Kilo 8291.
Roger, got you 57 Virginia, Victor Alpha this morning.
Thank you for 57 into Virginia, 73 QRZ, Whiskey 1 Delta, Echo.
Today I have with me Jim Cruz, Whiskey 6 Zulu Delta. Jim is a lot of things when it comes to ham radio, but one of the things that intrigued me was the fact that he's at the top of the leaderboard for a number of unique parks activated in 2022 with, I think, 633. And Jim, you can correct me in a minute, but a remarkable number of activations, and the year's not over yet. There's a lot that we can get into today that I hope to talk about, and we'll get at it now. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you. Pleasure being here. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to people about parks on the air and maybe bring a different take to parks on the air than we normally see that's on the internet today.
Well, I appreciate that. As many people know, I'm relatively new back into the hobby. I just got relicensed in March of this year, got involved with POTA in April, and I've made it a mission to talk to as many people as possible to find out those perspectives. But let's start with where you are, because you're obviously outside, and I'm assuming you might be at a park.
I am actually testing out a temporary portable rig in JW Corbett, which is Kilo 6311. And as you and I have spoken in the past, this is one of those kilos that was the killer kilos that you try to make in a park.
That's awesome. And this one's close to your home, you said, right?
It's very close to my home. In fact, if I felt so inclined, I could come out and walk into the west side probably in about 45 minutes.
Oh, that's fantastic. A little different than my situation here. But so have you activated yet today, or are we getting in the way of that?
I'm not really activating the park. I came out more to just test it because I've decided I'm going to be heading on the road next week. And so I wanted to set up this temporary setup with the 891, just test it out with the antennas, a couple antennas, and see how it performs. And did get a couple good QSOs. I got a park in the U.S. Virgin Islands. So, I'll play hunter today.
That's fantastic. It's interesting, and we'll get into this later on in the conversation, but already in this dialogue, your effort at planning is first and foremost, and I love that. You're there to make sure things work so that you're ready for the next one. And again, we'll get into that later. I think where I'd like to start today is your ham radio background. Are you one of those 3-decade veterans or a relative newcomer?
Well, I guess in time, license, I'm a relative newcomer, although I have an extra license. I was initially licensed back at the end of April in 2019. I got my tech license, and I quickly decided that I wanted to be a general because the prospect of DXing and contesting and doing QSO parties really intrigued me. So within a month, I went and sat for my general license. And, obviously that gives you the privileges to get on HF. And that was fun. I enjoyed that a lot. And fortunately, right before the COVID shutdowns, I was able to sit for two weekend course for the extra, and I received my extra in February of 2020. And the reason I went for an extra is because I wanted that extra bandwidth for DXing, and I discovered a lot of the DX contesters go down into our extra frequency range, and that's where I wanted to be.
And what brought you into ham radio in the first place?
It was interesting. I was a CBer back in the 80s, as probably most of us were. And of those of you from that age, my handle was Mr. Twister back then, really, really creative. And ham radio intrigued me back then, but I didn't have the time, to be honest with you, with a very young family and a pretty demanding corporate career. I didn't have time to sit and study to do the CW requirements. And that was really kind of a put off. And then, we fast forward to 2019, and, I was a pretty big survivalist, and, I'm not going to call myself a prepper, but, and that kind of intrigued me. One of my friends has a rather large YouTube channel, and I was watching it. He was talking about the infamous Baofeng. And, Baofeng has done more to ignite ham radio than what they get credit for. But anyway, I said, I wouldn't mind getting one of those. And so I bought one. This is before I was licensed. And I said, I looked on Amazon. I was able to get one I think it was like $18 on sale. I said, what's $18? That's less than going out to basic lunch to a McDonald's and having a couple burgers. And so I bought it. And nets were really active, on, simplex, or, you go through a repeater. And I said, man, I want to participate in that. And literally 2 weeks from the day I got the Baofeng to sitting for my tech was 2 weeks. And I went and sat for my tech license. And then the rest is kind of history.
I love that. And how long did it take you before you got involved with POTA?
Oh, I was kind of marginally involved. And let me just go back, even though I've only been licensed not quite 4 years, I and I certainly don't recommend people do this because, I guess it's confessions of a madman today for me. I spend probably a minimum of 40 hours a week on the radio. So I have got, vast experience on a radio in a very compressed period of time. But what brought me to POTA is back in 2000, I guess it was the beginning of 2000, I heard about POTA. And it kind of intrigued me. Didn't really know what it was. It certainly wasn't as sophisticated as it is today. There certainly weren't as many people on the radio with POTA. But I did go and I registered for a POTA account. And it probably sat dormant for a lot of months. And 2021 came, we had the shutdowns, and I did a lot of portable operations. As anybody knows, here in Southeast Florida, it was the only ones that really had a lot of restrictions. So every weekend I would go out and do portable operations outside of this tri-county area. I'd go to West Florida, I'd go to, just the county north of us or whatever. But I was traveling around and doing portable ops. It really appealed to me. And I did that for quite a while. And unfortunately, as you and I have talked, I had some severe health issues that hit me in 2021 that curtailed my operating quite a bit. And not curtailed, it stopped it. And finally, when things kind of got by me, I found myself being somewhat self-protective and reclusive because of what had happened to me. And one day I said, I'm always been super active and I'm always had a lot of energy, and I'm going to get out and start doing portable operations. And I revisited POTA at that point in time and did a few parks. And my method at that time was rather stupid and naive the way I did it. And, I would drive to North Florida, a 6-hour drive one way to activate one park and turn around and come back. Now, that certainly doesn't say there's a whole lot of intelligence in that. And so at the beginning of 2022, I said, you know what? I am going to approach this thing almost like a sport. And I decided that I was going to attack it. I came to realize that in Florida, with the exception of, as you and I have talked, 15 to 20 parks, you could pretty much plot out some routes and get numbers of parks in a trip, more so in a round trip if you kind of take a loop through Florida. And the issue with Florida is too, people don't realize how big Florida is. And so like for me to come out of the West Palm, Southeast Florida area to get to, let's say, Pensacola, that's about a 1,500 mile round trip, just if I go directly up and back. And then I've got all the water parks that are sitting, I've got the Keys, and, we've even got a park here, a POTA park here that's underwater. So, there's some unique challenges, distance and that. And, but that's how I did it. It was really interesting. I never viewed myself or really sought the awards. That wasn't my driving factor. Although, they kind of came organically. And as I told you in our conversation on the phone before this, is, I kind of got into it because we have a club member, one of my clubs I belong to, he's a hunter. And he kind of talked to me about it, and I started getting back into it. And I kept telling him, hey, and his name's Jim, K3ALW. And I said to him, I'm at 40 parks, I'm done. And then, it's only 10 more for 50. and, I got to 100. Well, I'm at 100, I'm done. Well, 200 wouldn't be that hard. And I just kept going on and on and on. And again, I certainly don't recommend somebody does the madness that I've done, because it's extremely time consuming, and not just activating, but the planning part of it is tremendous. And we'll talk, like you said, we'll talk about that a little bit later. And just it's expensive. You have to have the financial wherewithal to do it, particularly nowadays with gas being the price it is. And but it's been a great journey, and I'm going to blame you for kind of getting me going again. I thought, well, because I'm going to, at this next trip, I'll probably be pushing 700 parks total, and probably up in the 690s for the year. I've decided that maybe next year I'm going to go for the 1,000.
Nice.
But that's your fault.
Well, I'll take the heat for that. One of the things I'm interested in, Jim, is how your experience with ham radio, but specifically POTA, has evolved. I think on the phone you had mentioned, and I don't want to quote you, but that portable operations, after your health issues, gave you a new lease on life. And it seemed like a lot of the motivation was just to get out and experience the world again. And then over time, as you just put it, you hit the 40, then it's the 50, it's 100, and now again, you look at the POTA site, and Whiskey 6 Zulu Delta is at the top of unique parks list. How did that evolution happen? Was it just organically, or did you, was there, you're a planner, so was there a path there, or did you just step into this?
Well, interestingly, I never shot for a number until 600. And everything was just kind of organic. You get to a point, to be honest with you, as you get experience as an activator, you kind of have to view it that way. You have to, because all the planning in the world, and, I used an example to you one time when I drove the 6 hours up to northern, up near Jacksonville, someplace southwest of Jacksonville. And by the time I got up there, the weather was so horrendous, I had 3 QSOs, and I turned around and drove back. So, all the planning in the world, you say, well, I'm going to go get my 10 QSOs, doesn't necessarily come to fruition. Now, I've only got one that one single park, and it bugs the hell out of me that I didn't get that one activated. But I think you have to approach it as the numbers will come. And, to be quite honest, if you go and let's say you were to list a list of all, POTA activators, I would say the vast majority of activators probably have 30 or less parks, possibly even 20 or less parks they've activated, because it's a chore. And, surprisingly, maybe not at the level of planning I do, but a lot of the same planning to do the park JW Corbett, that is literally a 45-minute walk for me, is pretty, the basic planning is about the same I do if I go on the road. Well, there's some other elements you have to add.
It's encouraging.
But it was organic. It was all organic. And I just, every few days, every week, I'll check, and oh my gosh, I just got a new award or some new endorsements, or, I do it for fun.
Well, it's encouraging for me to hear this because, in my journey, it didn't take me that long to activate most of the parks within a 60-mile radius, which, I can leave the house and do an activation and be back in a couple hours and feel pretty good about it. But then I hit a plateau around 35 or 40, and it was clear it was going to be a lot more work, a lot more planning. And, I had this idea that, it'd be kind of fun to activate all the parks in Maine, not necessarily from an award standpoint, but it was just a good excuse to get to know more of Maine, even though I grew up here. A lot of these parks I haven't gone to. And now I'm at 57, but I'm certainly at that stage where the planning process is really critical. Because if I'm going to spend 2 or 3 days out on the road, and you spend even longer than that at times, I want to make sure it's effective. And this last activation I did, I was able to get 13 parks activated within a 4-day period. So that felt good. That put me at 57. But the next round of 10 is going to be, again, a lot of planning, a lot of work, and and kind of fitting it into the schedule. So again, it's encouraging to hear that maybe the best way to do it is not to look at the number and just keep plugging away at activating the parks, have a good time while you're doing it, and eventually you'll arrive. I don't expect that I'm going to arrive at your number anytime soon, but if I could get closer to that all parks in Maine, that would feel pretty good. And I think that's around 143, 146, which isn't too bad.
Kevin, you bring up something interesting, and I say this to people, and I speak around the various clubs around here about Parks on the Air and that. Don't lose sight of the fact that you're doing it for fun. If you make it not fun, it becomes drudgery. And I kind of parallel that to, I was really an avid trap shooter. I used to travel all over the country, and I would compete in the Grand American and all the different state tournaments and everything else. And literally one day I woke up and said, I can't even go shoot for fun, because everything was just motivating. Going forward to, I had to achieve and win this award, and I had to go win this medal, and I had to go win this tournament. And it took the fun out of it. POTA, it is fun. And you go out, and I have some experience, to give you an example, when you have these memories, I've run across moonshiners and sipped some moonshine with them. And I was in Louisiana around New Orleans and ran across some of the Cajuns. I thought I was talking to the people off that program, Swamp People. And after I activated, they invited me to come over for a crawdad boil. And we sat there and had a few beers and crawdads. And, I've had my animal encounters. I had a mama bear with 2 cubs, and that was a little frightening. And I've had a Florida panther walk up within 50 feet behind me. And, those memories, that's fun. And you can't win an award for that. There is no, hey, here's the walk up behind you panther award.
Tell me more about that, because I unfortunately look at social media once in a while, and the POTA related social media, and there's always a story about the park ranger that wasn't helpful, or the person that was antagonistic. But I've got to be honest, I've never experienced that. When I go to parks, people are curious, they have questions to ask. Largely the park rangers are helpful. Quite often they've already seen a ham radio operator at the park, so they know what I'm up to. But I agree. I have found that to be part of the experience. I don't go out looking to meet people. I go to operate and to activate. But I often come back with those stories. So tell me, from your perspective, have you had some negative experiences or very few?
I've not had a negative experience. The only time I was had an encounter with a park ranger, I forget where it was. It was up in northern Florida. And again, I think this is part of the planning process too. So, when you need to understand where you're going. But the park ranger came up to me, and, I had my radio up, and you have to understand a lot of these these wildlife management areas or some of these remote parks, they haven't seen a radio operator out there. The only radio they know is the one they've got for their, the wildlife management radio and their CB and their pickup truck. So they don't really know what you're doing. And the guy walked up to me and asked me what I was doing. I told him, and he was smart enough. He did ask me for my license, my SEC license, and I showed it to him. And all of a sudden, we're on this 45-minute discussion about ham radio, and he was like just enthralled by it. So, what could have been a negative, if I had the wrong attitude about it, turned out to be a very positive experience. And we both left better for it. So I've met a lot of people, and I think you brought up just now when you said about, you meet people and ask you questions. The other thing we as Parks on the Air activators, and, if you're out there enough, is we are the ambassadors, and from 2 different perspectives. First and foremost, we're an ambassador for ham radio in general, and how we act and conduct ourselves in many aspects out there, activating parks in wildlife management areas or state parks or federal, reserves or whatever it is, reflects on the community in total. And then we are ambassadors for Parks on the Air. We as activators out there are the biggest advertisement for POTA that there possibly could be. because you never know if you're speaking to a ham radio operator who walks up and asks what you're doing, and all of a sudden, oh, I never heard about POTA before. And so you're helping to promote that also. So you really got to kind of approach it from two different angles there. Always be courteous, and I said, if you go into a wildlife management area or whatever it is, make sure that you leave it the same or better than when you leave it, when you came. So to me, it's no negatives, all positive. I didn't like meeting the bear with her cubs, but
it reminds me.
She was not that far away from me. She was within like 75 feet. So it was interesting.
We have an expression in Maine that probably is common across the country, but kicking the dirt. And I'm constantly reminded of that when I go to the parks, that the conversations with people I meet need to be slow and measured and pace yourself. I had an experience at Fort Point State Park where I really wanted to get into the park after sunset. I needed permission to do that, and I also wanted to set up a portable ice shack because it was going to be cool that night. It was a big ask, and I found myself kicking the dirt and just having a conversation with this guy. He was awesome. He didn't say yes right away. It took him a while. He made me work for it, but it was part of the fun. I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed meeting this person and his friend and explaining to him what was going on, and ultimately, I was given him the permission to operate after sunset and actually drive into an out of bounds area, which helped my setup tremendously. Ended up activating on 20 and 40. Didn't all go as I had hoped, but that's part of the course. So let's get into the planning, because I know you're big on planning. I'm so impressed with how that process works. Give us an idea of what you would plan for say a 3 to 4 day trip. What does that look like for you?
Well, they're never 3 to 4 day trips for me. They're generally 10 days to 3 weeks. I'll be on the road. So my planning is fairly intensive. When I do my planning, first and foremost, what I will do is I will start identifying what parks I am going to, and I'm going to put this in quotation mark, attempt to activate in my trip. Okay, because that may change once I get on the road. But I have a basic course or a course that I set out, and in that I start from that very basic level. I start planning the actual route, how I'm going to drive. And then I start estimating how much time it may take me, including the activative, to get from one park to the next. Okay. Because, when I get and if you've read my QRZ page, I say I'm a Parks on the Air road warrior. And, it's not uncommon for me to do 8-10 parks in a day. And so, I'm really trying to find parks that are close together or easy access, et cetera, et cetera. Once I'm done with that process, then becomes, I think, the real research. And what I mean by that is I will go and I will start looking at each individual park, and I will go to the state site, federal site, whatever it is, and I will start reading about those different locations I'm going to for a number of reasons. Number one is I want to see what their hours of operation are. Number two, I want to see if they will allow overnight camping, and I'll come back to that in a minute, an overnight stay. Number three, are there certain rules in place that are unique to that park? Because all in the state of Florida, and let me come in, we've talked to this, but I am the only person who's ever activated all 416 parks in Florida. So that was a chore in and of itself. But you want to understand the rules, because not every wildlife management area in, let's say, particularly in Florida, is the same in its rules. They may have a core set of rules, but there may be some very specific to that area. So I find that, and what are the fees? Are there some fees? Now here in Florida, I don't really have to worry about it because because I'm a senior citizen. I have a lifetime license that I don't have to pay or even pay to camp in a wildlife management area. Okay, so I can do that. And I think, so I get that done. And then the very next thing I do as I go along is as I'm doing my research, I will start going over to the internet site, and I will see if I can find photographs of where I'm going. because you can look at these beautiful pictures on the state site and everything, and all of a sudden you get there and go, what the heck is this? This doesn't even look like what they did. It's almost like a dating site. Here's the picture on the dating site, and you go, oh my God, here's Godzilla. And so I go and I look at pictures, and I not just one or two. I look at different ones. I want to see a picture of the trails if I can. I want to see the picture of what the entrance looks like. I want to see the picture if they have a parking lot. I want to see a lot of different things. And once I get that all done, and I feel comfortable that I've researched enough, and I'll make notes, as I'm going along, and that then comes the planning of what I personally need. As stupid as this may sound, you have to get it down to the basics. Like on this next trip, as you can see, my hair is very short. I'm going to probably be gone about 3 weeks, so I had my hair buzzed off. Because 2 weeks into this, I don't want to wake up and I look like my head's been stuck in an electric socket. And it's easier to take care of. And so then what toiletries do you need? What clothes do you need? And I typically will stay in a hotel like every third night. But when I'm doing my parks, I will stop someplace, truck stop or something, and I will, bathe myself and, change clothes and everything else. And then I afford myself to, the luxury of staying in a hotel every 3 days, sometimes 2 days. So that becomes a part of it. Then you start putting the financial aspect to it, And I think in today's world, it is tough, particularly over, this last year. For a lot of people to go out and not even remotely come to close what I do, but even in the 57 parks, there's a financial burden associated with that, and so you really have to plan all of that, and then you go from there. Then next thing you know, you're in the car, and an hour into, you say, "What the heck am I doing?"
So I think that, I don't know if this is in one of our earlier conversations or I read it somewhere. I think you aim to activate 6 to 8 parks a day. Is that part of the plan?
Always.
Okay.
Always. Yeah. Normally my goal is like 8. Normally.
So one of the things I've seen, and I think this is part of the fun for me, despite all of my planning, and I don't do it to the degree that you do, and I do go online and look at photos. I activated Heard's Pond Wildlife Management Area. Couldn't find a way in, and I was able to find these photos of fishermen. So I knew, okay, if they're finding a way in, there's a way in. But despite all that, there are challenges that always seem to come up. And as I said, I think that's part of the fun. The better my planning is, it seems like I have more capacity to handle the challenges that I get faced with. And I presume you do too. Despite all of your research, you must show up at parks or wildlife management areas and there's a gate up or there's something has changed. Does that happen often for you?
Oh yeah, you will find that in our previous conversation, I said, if in my car right now, in my SUV, I have like a storage compartment over that back deck in there. This came with the thing. There's, 5 different antenna systems in there. And point case is I went to one in Melbourne, which is not that far from me. And I get there and I go, where's the trees that were on this aerial photo? And I had looked at all this, and somewhere along the line, these pictures were so outdated that these trees, so I said, I can't throw a wire up. So it's kind of a funny story. So I said, you know what? I'm gonna throw up my 17-foot whip. And so I took out the whip and I clamped it to the barbecue grill because it's metal and anchored in the ground. And Kevin, I don't know what possessed me. And I said, you know what? Because I carry that orange, like I carry a pink, fluorescent pink marking tape. If you put like a counterpoise or something, you should flag it. So I put this tape on there and so I said, I'm going to put it on this 17-foot whip, which is probably about now 20 feet up in the air. So I do the first section and every 2 sections down. And I sit down and start operating. I hear this noise. And I said, what the heck is this noise? And these 2 ultralights, we got the parachute and it flew right over that antenna. And so when they landed probably 75 feet away from me. And the guy goes, we really appreciate you marking that antenna. Because if I had not, the guy would, they'd taken the antenna down. So, you have to be prepared to do things. I carry at any time I'm on the road, well, except now because I'm so close to home, I take a minimum of two radios with me. There's redundancy in everything, from a battery perspective, a power perspective. My main operating is a 40 amp hour bioenno, backed up by a 15-hour bioenno, which is backed up by entire solar system panels with, my box has got a solar controller in the back, and followed by a generator if I need it. So, you gotta, particularly if you're on the road, can you imagine being in Texas like I was, and all of a sudden I'm in the middle of the desert in New Mexico and my radio goes bad? Well, there's a wasted trip. And so the planning is, at so many levels.
Yeah, I've certainly found myself without the right equipment, or something didn't work, or didn't have a cable. And now if I'm going to go any distance at all, the back of my car is packed. And I'm sure some people would look at it and say, that's ridiculous. But I've gotten to places before and something didn't work, and I just don't want to be in that position again. I've got to say, I haven't taken it to the next level and start traveling with a second radio. That's a good idea. Maybe I need to put that on my wish list. But what is your ideal setup, Jim? If you, with all that equipment, the antenna choices, and I know it's situational, but if you had your choice, what would come out of the back of your car for a setup?
Well, that when we talked about in the conversation is, as activators like me are becoming more sophisticated in our operations. So my next level, and unfortunately I'm not going to be able to do it before this upcoming trip, but my next level will be, I've obviously removed my 7300, and just, I want to let people know that one of the reasons I took the 7300 out, great radio, it's good for that. Unfortunately, there's a quirk in it, and I had three 7300s. They all had the same quirk. If you're going to do FT8, it's really difficult to run it over 35 watts. Sometimes you start getting a sound card error, and actually, it's been around so long that the actual W6ZD manual has a line item about that. But my ideal setup is I am probably in the box going to put one of these two radios. Either it's going to be an FT991A, or it will be the new Yaesu FT710. And what's going to take it to the next step is I am now researching to put in a mobile amplifier. So, as we discussed before, on the road, my primary thing is using FT8. Not that I necessarily like FT8 that much, because there's an impersonal, aspect to it. But as you well know, when you're an activator and using phone, you've got to find the open frequency and hope the propagation is going to frequency. And then you got to hope to some, one of these old geezers out there who doesn't like POTA is starting to send his tuning tones over you, and who then decides to start doing CW at 14343 because they don't like you, and then they follow you all over, and if you spot, they just follow the spot. But FT4, FT8 and FT4 is what it is. You just get on there and you don't have that hassle. But the reason for an amplifier is like if you catch me doing FT8 at home, which is a much more elaborate. I run FT8 at 100 watts minimum. If you hear me phone, I'm running 400 to 600 watts minimum, and that's what I'm going to do when I'm on the road. Is when you're going to hear me on FT8, and the part of the reason is, as Jason said in your interview with him, POTA is growing exponentially. Now, in the United States, POTA is not going to grow that much in parks. It may, hunters and activators, but park-wise, we're pretty much going to be static now. But if we go internationally, it is growing right and left. And I can't tell you, even begin to tell you the numbers of DX QSOs I have when I'm calling CQ POTA. Give you example. I mean, it's not uncommon to get Russia or the Ukraine or Sweden But then all of a sudden, I've gotten Malta, I've gotten the Seychelles Islands, I have gotten India one time. I mean, you get them from all over the world. And so I'm thinking to myself, and generally they're in the evening, and generally they're going to be on 15 or 17. So I'm thinking to myself, okay, I'm going to take some of that iffiness and I'm going to start pumping power to do it. So, at 100 watts FT8, they're more than likely going to hear me. At 400 to 600 watts, they're more than likely going to hear me.
Jim, I'm
we come up with.
I'm intrigued to hear that. Are you seeing a lot more activators consider amplifiers? You're the first person I've heard talk about that, so I'm just curious. Is that a growing trend?
Again, I think the title to your YouTube video on this should be "Confessions of a Madman."
I like it. I'll use that.
I don't, or maybe the POTA Madman or something. I certainly don't. It's one of those things is that don't do as I say, because I am just, to me, it's like radio sport to me. But you also understand, like, let's say I do a hard day of POTA and I've done, 8 parts, 10 parts. And to give you an example, I have operated up to 16 hours in a day, 17 hours in a day, and got as many parts as I can, and etc. And then I'll sit at night and I'm, this time camping out, and I've got my little setup and everything else. And you would not be surprised to see all of a sudden I fire up the radio and I'm doing DX, till 2:30 in the morning. And so the method to my madness is, I would do that at home, obviously. So why not do it on the road? So, there's kind of a twofold. Yeah, now I definitely have a distinct advantage in POTA by going, amplifier and, a much more upgraded radio. And, for a while I was taking my FTDX10 with me, and then with the amplifier, it's going to step it up a little bit. But so you certainly, trust me on this, you certainly don't need that. I don't recommend it. It's a tremendous financial, investment. When the 7300, the box, if you throw in solar panels and the battery box I had, the 40 amp, you're probably talking $3,500 to $4,000. And it's, the average person can't afford that, and they shouldn't have to. I say keep it simple, stupid. When I started out and I was doing portable, I was using I started out, I would actually disconnect my 718, my ICOM 718, which is about the most basic radio you could possibly get. And I would take it to the park and I would use a 15 amp hour battery. Heck, at that point, I was using a 12 amp hour SLA battery. And, and a buddy ball. That's what I was doing. And so then I said, I really want something more portable. And I went to an 891. Tremendous radio. They're considerably up in price now as they were 3 years ago. And I bought an auto tuner for it because you need that. And, that's more than adequate to do parks. They're more than adequate. I mean, you can go from 5 to 100 watts and tremendous receive on it. I just took it, a step further because, as we discussed this, I look a little bit further past POTA too, because if we look at POTA and we look at the origins of POTA, the true origins of POTA, and Jason, spoke about when ARRL had their national parks on the air day, and then the typical ARRL, to get a great idea and they drop it, which is also dropping their membership, but that's another story. And then Jason saw an opportunity with a group of people, and they took it a next step further. But prior to that National Parks on the Air, there was an organization out in California that did something like Parks. I think they even called it Parks on the Air or something like that. And there are also some state parks on the air, like Florida has Florida Parks on the Air. There's a whole other group. But what they did is they would plan a weekend every month, and they would get 5 or 6 different clubs. And the core of it was emergency communications operations. And that's really is what is at the core of what we do. Okay. And I think even the POTA site, I think, says about promoting emergency operations, or at least it did at one point. Our POTA website said that, that. So to me, is when I was building this box, and a perfect example, we just had Hurricane Ian here, is I could pick up and go someplace and do emergency operations for anybody who requires me, and literally be packed up and leave within 15 minutes. And so, I have this beautiful elaborate box, and I'm going to do this, but I have a further view of it than the typical POTA operator. POTA's looking at POTA, and I'm looking at POTA is my training grounds for emergency operations. And I will say now, and I feel safe saying, it would be a rare occasion that I couldn't meet the challenge of setting up and operating. I mean, it would have to be like a really, I can't even think of a scenario right now because I've encountered so many, and that's what we should be looking at, and I got asked during Ian, if required, would I be willing to go do emergency operations, somewhere in the state of Florida? And I said, absolutely. And their thing was, is you've got so much practice doing portable.
Well,
we have to look further than just our own hobby.
I appreciate your clarity around that. The idea that emergency communication really is foundational to POTA.
Yeah.
I think if you start there and realize, you don't need a lot. You just need to know what you're doing and have the minimum equipment. And I can go out to a park or go to not even a park. I can go outside my house and set up and be operational and make solid contacts throughout the country as well as DX. So, thank you for bringing me back to that. I am intrigued about the DX element. I've never really thought of POTA as a DX radio sport, even though I'm really into DX. However, I'll get half a dozen DX contacts almost by chance, but I don't look for them intentionally. And just last night, I got an email from Bob, Whiskey Charlie 1 November, who's a big activator here in New England, and he had done an activation yesterday. I think it was in Massachusetts, and I believe 80% of his contacts were DX contacts, 79 contacts out of his activation were all DX, Europe, Eastern Europe, and it really opened my eyes. And I think this goes back to the amplifier and maybe re-looking at some of our equipment. If DX became the objective for me, which it might, because there's so many new parks being authorized and activated worldwide, I can see this endeavor with POTA going off in a whole new direction for me and a whole other level of excitement.
Let's separate those two, and I think you bring up a great point. And Jason brought up how the emphasis now is on activate or not activating, but identifying new international parks. Africa is certainly one of them. That you've got parks now like in Gambia and different places in Africa. DX and POTA are really kind of very two separate things. I was a DXer. What that means, I would make the effort and I would have my spotting programs that I could see who's on, and whatever frequency it was. And then I would go and try to get them. And to be honest with you, a basic 100 watt radio, I had tremendous success doing that. Okay, my first DX contest was actually my very first QSO ever as a general, S57 DX, which is Yannick Cleric. And it was with a ICOM 718 at 100 watts. He's in Slovenia, and I'm using a 24-foot wire antenna. So, I don't know how much more basic, unless I'd used a coat hanger as an antenna, that you could get to that. So you don't need that. But what's happening with POTA and the evolution of POTA and the tremendous popularity it's gaining, by default, there's going to be a DX component of that. In fact, to the point that POTA has an award. I didn't know it existed. In one of my days looking, I saw it there, a DX award. And I think it goes by fives. And I thought, what the heck is this? It doesn't tell you exactly what five you had, but you had five entities. And all of a sudden I looked a couple of weeks, and all of a sudden it was 10. I thought, okay, great. I'm winning awards I didn't know existed. I've had parks with New Zealand. Okay, Australia, England, all over the place. But by default, you're going to find yourself getting into DX, particularly if you do it in the evening. Mm-hmm. And, you can get into the evening, and a lot of times, the foreigners operators like 15 meters and like 17 meters, 20 is all right, but they'll be there. And I've had logs that were nothing but DX guys. I mean, I would just call, and not purposely looking for them. I'll just call it, and they just happen to be there. And all of a sudden, and those are the times, instead of my typical 11, 12 QSOs I'm looking to activate, that I'll stay on the radio an extended time because I know they're looking for U.S. parks. And I will stay on with them for a longer period of time. But if I were to take all the QSOs that I've had in POTA in 2022, I would say at this juncture, I think I've got close to, well, it's well over 15,000 QSOs for POTA this year. I would say there's well over 1,000, maybe 1,500 that are DX. And those Latin America is big into it. You've got Dominican Republic, Mexico's getting into it. Canada is obviously big into it. And you're just going to gravitate to that. And I think that's going to spur other people's interest in DX. And I want to bring up a point, and we talked about it on the phone. And I think POTA doesn't quite recognize their impact on radio. As I told you before, when I first started, I like QSO parties, I like DXing, and there used to be a lot of QSO parties. You could plan your whole weekend around QSO parties, internationally or domestically. Well, with COVID, you would have thought that would have grown, but it actually diminished. And so what's happened now, when you do see QSO parties, they're normally doing RIDI, or they're doing CW, or PSK 31, or Hellscriber. They're doing something that most of us don't do. And people were complaining there wasn't a whole lot going on HF, and they were right. And POTA, in my humble opinion, has reinvigorated HF radio. It is rare that you can go on I don't care what time of the day or night it is, that you can go on the radio, and if you call CQ POTA, I don't care if it's 3 o'clock, someone will probably answer you. Okay, and probably more than one. And I think it's given people a reason to get on. It certainly has, from a hunter's perspective, you've got dramatically more people on the radio. I think, as we've discussed, I think POTA needs to recognize a difference between the hunter and the activator. I think it's a little too slanted towards the hunter, because without the activator, they're not going to have hunters. And but I think it's been a tremendous force on bringing HF back to the forefront, and people interested into it. They, as a hunter, you're going to get QSOs. You're going to. All you have to do is look at the spotting program. Just you don't even have to search and pounce. Or hunt and pounce. You just bang. You just go there and you're there. So to me, it's tremendous impact, and I think they don't do quite as good job promoting the influence they've had on HF.
Well, again, I appreciate your clarity. It's a big statement that POTA alone has reinvigorated HF radio, and I think you're right. You're absolutely right. As someone who operated quite a bit when I was licensed back in the 80s, to turn the computer on this March after relicensing and hear POTA and get excited about that, but also to see the community of people involved with it. I'm sure you've experienced the same thing. I can get on any day, and there are at least a dozen or 24 people across the country that I've talked to multiple times. And even though I've not met them in person, I've never had a conversation like this via Zoom. I feel like they're my friends, and they'll send me a note, an email. They'll send a note through my QRZ email. I feel as though I know these people. I know they'll look for me when I'm on the spotting page. I try to do the same for them. Whether it's Tom, Victor Echo 3, Tango Hotel Romeo up in Ontario, Alpha Charlie 0, Charlie Uniform Patty. I mean, I just go on and on. November 5, Hotel Alpha, who's almost always a 3x3. I mean, he tries so hard, and I probably talk to him on every single activation, and I just love that part of it.
He is out there. They're always out there. You talk about community, and I don't make it a practice. I hope we talk a little bit about logging and other things. But anyway, I don't make it a practice to send QSL cards. I have them. But my God, if I go on a trip like this next trip, I could end up with 1,000 plus QSOs, and I'm not going to send 1,000 QSL cards. Surprising. I will get notes, and I don't email me, thank you for this and that. And, I appreciate that. And I will get QSL cards, and I can't tell you I would say probably about 15-20% of the QSR cards I have will come with like $5 or $10 in it. And they'll write a note. Hey, we really appreciate, here's something to help you pay for your gas. Okay, now, I don't need the money. Trust me, I don't need that money. And so my approach, first of all, you say, wow, somebody really gets it, what we go through as activators, and they appreciate it. But then what I've done is I've taken that money and I told you on the phone, I have a box and I just put the money over there. And one of these days I'll count it. And when I have enough money, I will sponsor an event here, for the local clubs. There's like 3-4 clubs around us. And I'll sponsor a POTA event in one of these wildlife management areas and introduce more people to POTA. But it is a community, and there's certain people appreciate it. I will say this: I think every hunter, in order to be a hunter, should have to activate one time so they know what it takes.
Yeah,
because it is not easy. I don't care how many times you practice, you still got. I mean, I can set up and be operating in 5 minutes or less typically. But you still got to put it up. You got to take it down. You got to travel the next place, and sometimes you got to drag your butt to do it because you're just tired. You didn't sleep good the night before, or whatever it may be. Maybe the bear was trying to get the house, so he thought you were the meal for the evening, or I think it is a community, and I've had people send me their phone numbers, and I've talked to them on the phone, and I've had guys ask, "Hey, could you help me, get started in POTA?" Hey, Archie Delphin out of Maryland, who's like one of the top in number, the sheer QSO activations, but he only does about 20 or 30 parks, and he's, that's this route. We have a guy here in Florida does the same thing, Bill N4NYM. He does it, and Del one time, we're always giving each other QSOs, and he actually emailed me, asked me to give him a call, and he was interested in my Go Box. Explain to me your Go Box. Where'd you buy the components and everything else? And that's the family part of our community. The help. I'm perfectly willing to share everything I use. My techniques, shortcuts. Whatever it may be. I gave people a shortcut now on using FT8 over phone, and the reason being is, you don't have to deal with the idiots and there's plenty of them, trust me. It makes it easy, it makes it fast, it's, weak signal, you can get propagation isn't as much a factor. There's a bunch of things there, but it is a family, and we need to share. As a family, we need to share.
So speaking of techniques, and you mentioned logging. Talk to me about how you have set up your logging process. I think you're pretty committed to uploading logs on a daily basis, which I also do, and I'm really impressed that that more and more people are doing that. But tell me about your logging system and process. What's your go-to?
Well, again, that's an evolution in and of itself. When I started out doing it, I've never been one that liked paper logs from day one. I'm very computer savvy, but I was just, I was too lazy to write something and, come up with a comma delineated, delineated. I'm not going to do that. So I used QRZ, which is probably the worst logging program ever invented. It is a nightmare, and it's not built for what the requirements of what Parks on the Air is. Okay, and I was doing phone. That's what I started out was phone, but it didn't have a park number in it, and it was a bunch of different things. And so, I would try to find different. Then I was going to use N1MM, which is not designed for Parks on the Air either. And so you've got, you had to kind of work around that, and then I guess it had to be in 2021 sometime. HamRS was just kind of getting out there. So I said, I'll give it a try. And it's nothing like it was now. It was, there was some quirks in it. And, I made a mistake one time in pointing out that when you use the field day template, that it wasn't doing certain things, and all of a sudden they were asking. I got on this string of emails that and I still get these emails. Okay, and it evolved. Okay, and that kind of took it to the next level now, because it was easy. You put your park number in, and it would automatically check to make sure the call sign was correct or not. If it was in the database, that kind of evolved to that too. And anyway, then they made the time dynamic instead of static. It used to be you have to keep hitting to get the time to set up, and so it evolved. And so, but yeah, you still, if you're doing phone at that point in time, you still had to take that log, and then you had to update it to QRZ, and then Logbook of the World, and EQSL, and Parks on the Air. So you were, at least 4 uploads, maybe 5, and that was kind of drudgery. And for me, it was time consuming because typically, although I think I'm going to change it this trip, I upload immediately after I activate a park. Immediately. When I leave to the next one, that park is already forgotten. I'm on to the next one. So when I got into FT8, it was kind of a pain in the butt, because I had to then go to the WJST and finagle that thing to upload to Parks on the Air and whatever it was. It was really a pain in the butt. And I discovered Grid Tracker. And I've been using Grid Tracker on it for a long time now. And you can actually take Grid Tracker, and if you set it up correctly, the only thing it doesn't log to is Parks on the Air. I do think that's coming because they've added a column, I think it was 2 firmware updates ago, that now have the column says POTA, and it puts the park number in there. So I think the next iteration, and also on their map, if you click one of their icons, it'll tell you where all the POTAs, they put it, it's kind of cute. It looks like a little Christmas tree, and I'll tell you where. I think the next one's going to be that you'll be able to say, I'm going to do, as an activator, I'm doing POTA, and I'm going to be able to put a park in, it's going to add it in. What I do when I log, and the thing comes up from WSJT in the comments section, I will put the park number so when somebody says, well, I had a QSO with you at Park Kilo 6311, I can actually sort and find 6311 and help them out if they don't have time or something like that. But that was a big game changer for me. And, once, because when I hit confirm on Grid Tracker, everything except Parks on the Air is logged. You just see a zip right on through. And I think that's essential, by the way, because I can't tell you how many times, somebody could say it's a huge number, that so we don't have a QSO with you, and I have it nowhere, and all of a sudden I will go over to, let's say, EQSL, and I'll go and look up their call sign, and sure enough, it's there, and I could pick up the information there and, confirm their QSO with me. So yeah, there was an evolution to it. HamOS is extremely easy to use, either as a hunter or a logger or an activator. And I really need, I tell people that as a hunter, why bother logging unless you just want to log a QSO, because no matter what, if I don't decide to upload my log, you're not getting any credit anyway.
Right.
So why go through that effort? It's a meaningless log. And, I can't tell you how many people who are hunters will email and go, oh, I've got this thing here, but, what park were you at? And I tell them, look at your hunter log. They just they've gotten so lazy, I hate to say this, that everything's handed to them, that the thought process is kind of left them. And I said, that's why there needs to be some separation in the two, activator versus hunter.
Well, Jim, clearly we could talk for another hour, and maybe you would honor me by being on another interview down the road. Maybe I'll catch you out on the road, but I really appreciate your time today. Are there any closing thoughts for those POTA activators that are listening right now?
Yeah, I think, or even prospective POTA guys. And I will say, I'm going to thank you again for the opportunity to come on here. And the reason I did, I've been asked to do other interviews and I've always turned them down. You're the first, and you will probably be the only one. And the reason being is the videos you see on YouTube, be honest with you, I don't care if it's one of the YouTube gang over there, are worthless. They sit around at a table and they get more enjoyment out of listening to themselves make a QSO, and all you're listening is a guy on a radio making a QSO. And what did you learn from that? You learn nothing. And so to me it's fine, but go out and do an activation. If you're a hunter and go out and do an activation so you understand what an activator goes through. Activator, do some hunter. By default of us doing park to parks, we become a hunter, but do hunting sometime and have an appreciation for what each one of us does. Also, I'm going to say is when you want to get involved in POTA, and by doing hunting and activating 1 or 2 times an activation, maybe 3 times, have an idea, then decide which direction you want to go into. Don't say, oh, I want to do POTA and go out and spend $1,000 on equipment and decide you don't like doing activations. Point in case, how many guys have gone out there and bought an ICOM 705, QRP station, and you see it on QRZ at a sale a month later because they figured out 5 watts doesn't hack it. Okay. So figure out what you want to do. Okay. Once you've had a little bit of experience, and then go make the investment in that and go down that route. But when you buy that equipment, let's say an 891, that 891 is good in your activation. It's good at home. It's good, there's a lot of, alternatives to use that in. And I think that's the key. And as a newbie, ask questions. Don't be afraid to look up W6ZD on QRZ because my email's there, and send me an email. Hey, what do you think? I've had guys in Florida who want to get active and say, hey, I see you were in park number so-and-so. Is there any clues you could tell me on where to go in that park? Okay. And I think we as experienced activators need to Elmer the younger people getting, or not just the newer people getting into our hobby and actively do so. And like in this case, I'm here to this because I think I listening to that conversation with Jason, I learned a couple things there. And I think by talking can give people information other than just sitting here listening to me make QSOs. Maybe one of these days, if we plan it and I'm on the road, maybe we'll just kind of set the camera back and you'll see me set up for an operation.
Absolutely. I'm in. I appreciate all of your insight today, Jim. It's been really helpful. And I think that the advice that you've wrapped up with, particularly getting out and activating, or maybe for us activators, hunting more often, understanding what the other person's doing, but also asking for advice. Those are all really great suggestions. I've been talking today to Jim Cruz, Whiskey 6 Zulu Delta. You'll definitely see him on the POTA spotting page as he works toward his 700 unique parks activated. I really appreciate you taking the time today, Jim. Thank you.
You take care. Thank you for the opportunity again, and hopefully it's helpful to somebody. You take care.
Whiskey 1 Delta Echo Delta.
Alpha Golf 2 Sierra.
Alpha Golf 2 Sierra, you're 5x9 at Kilo 8291.
Roger. You're also 5'9", New Jersey.
Thank you for New Jersey, 73 QRZ, Whiskey 1 Delta Echo Delta. CQ POTA, CQ POTA, CQ Parks on the air, Whiskey 1 Delta Echo Delta.